Scream 4, coming a decade after Scream 3, has a lot of ground to cover. As it was originally designed to be the beginning of a new trilogy, it has to re-establish Scream as a formidable presence in horror, alongside reintroducing our core characters and giving us new ones to care about. It also has to comment on a turbulent decade for the genre, as well as look at the technological advances and the way our communication methods and presence in the world has radically changed. In actual fact, the biggest advantage to Scream 4 is that its box office was not significant enough to greenlight a fifth film, resulting in it being a potent one-off addition that contributes significantly to the conversation without taking anything away from the narrative conclusion of the first trilogy. The opening of Scream 4 seems to acknowledge that this is a start-again scenario by repeating the basic setup: a phone call, a sinister voice, a conversation about horror, and a murder, only to then unseat the audience by revealing it to be the in-film beginning of Stab 6, which then is revealed to be a double fake-out by the next two characters being the opening of Stab 7. This short segment before the movie begins is densely packed with something of a mission statement for the movie to come. It acknowledges the state of horror at the time, with a reference to torture porn, or gornography as it was later termed, a subgenre of movies that took off in the 2000s after the success of Saw. These films almost seem like a reaction to the early 2000s PG-13 rated movies, following concerns about movie violence raised after Columbine. Essentially forming an American New Extreme movement, these films would usually feature death scenes that focused much more on the suffering and the pain of the various victims, dragging out their demise to make the audience suffer. Saw, being the progenitor of these types of films, would of course follow the trend of quick sequels, releasing one every year until 2010. Scream 4 acknowledges the return to overt violence, but states out loud such things are not scary, something Scream always aimed to be amongst the dark humour. There is the acknowledgement of social media in references to Facebook and Twitter. This is a nod to what might have been expected as a minor upgrade to the series' formula, with the killer stalking his victims in direct messaging, and essentially stating they are not going down that route, although smartphone technology does factor in later. There is the tip of the hat to what was once revolutionary is now more than a decade behind us, and that the deconstruction of horror's cliches and the meta-references may be old hat, gently mocking itself rather than the overt stylings of the parody scary movie franchise. There is a seeming frustration behind this segment, but also an agreement with the audience that yes, it may be difficult to make Scream valid again. Scream 4 makes great pains within the narrative to talk about how the killers are essentially remaking the narrative of the original massacre, immortalized by the first Stab movie. Jill casts herself in Sidney's role as the heroic survivor, with Charlie casting himself in the Randy role, only to be put into the Stu role later by Jill, who stabs him to death, seeking the spotlight for herself. This continues the thread of generational trauma that is consistent with the original trilogy, but where before we had Sidney having to contend with the infamy of her mother's infidelity and murder, this time Jill complains that she has had to grow up in the shadow of reverence for Sidney, and her endurance in the face of continued trauma, and her stardom for being the hero of the Stab movies, as she was within Scream's own narrative. The overarching theme of the movie is brand recognition. The notion of remaking, and thus inherently the lack of original thinking, is both an observation of the younger generation within the movie and the movie industry. Jill's motivation is essentially to acquire a free ride through life on the back of her survival. It is implied that this is what she perceives in Sidney, and wants for herself, yet this feeds into a generational idea of gaining popularity on social media, acquiring fans, and gets eerily more prescient in the current culture of influencers and TikTok. Jill doesn't seek to achieve anything for herself beyond what is granted to her by a culture ready to make everybody a star at the drop of a hat, just as studios embarking on a remake have to ride the coattails of previous success in order to get noticed. A scene in the movie depicting movie nerd Kirby being tormented by the killer about naming a remake of a groundbreaking horror movie sees Kirby launch into reeling off a total of 16 titles of remakes that have all happened within a 7-year period, hoping that one of those will be the answer the killer seeks. Although the killer's question is not heard in full due to Kirby's interruption, the sheer volume of films Kirby names suggests the answer could conceivably be any of them, clearly giving the audience a sense of distaste from the filmmakers about the lack of originality within this decade, and at the same time, a good joke about how ridiculous a question it would be to be able to pick them apart enough to give the right answer. Playing against the theme of remakes in the movie is the idea of reinvention. Sydney seeks to reinvent herself as a survivor, rather than a perpetual victim, through the publishing of her memoir and self-help book, Out of Darkness. Similarly, Gail Weathers, now married to Dewey, and having given up her reporting days, seeks to reinvent herself from author of the Woodsboro Murders to a writer of fiction. Yet both Sydney and Gail, as a result of Jill and Charlie's remake Massacre, find themselves both drawn back into their familiar roles, with Gail pursuing her own leads independent of the law, and Sydney once again stalked and tormented by Ghostface as threats are made against her and her extended family. This can also be read as a sly meta-commentary on the creative force behind the movies. Wes Craven sought to distance himself from horror in certain respects, directing Meryl Streep in Music of the Heart, writing a sci-fi novel, The Fountain Society, and directing such films as Red Eye and a segment of the anthology movie Parashitem. Yet each time found himself drawn back into the horror genre because of the lucrative nature of his name and his reputation for delivering the goods.
But did that lock you into a genre?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
And do you regret that at all? I mean, it's been very profitable for you.
It's been profitable.
And you've got a chance to make a lot of films.
Yeah. I've made probably between television movies and theatrical movies, probably 20, 25 films. So, and I've been working most of the time.
But has been it hard for you to go to Hollywood and say, I can do something beyond, as good as these horror films are?
That's very difficult. Because I made my first two films.
I want to make a love story.
Yeah.
I want to make
Forget it.
Yeah. Forget it.
Yeah. They'll say, well, but we have something here on witchcraft. Or we have,
because we know it'll make money, and we know you know how to do that.
Right.
Stick to what you know.
Kevin Williamson achieved great success on TV, but never quite escaped the shadow of his first great success, and again here returned as writer. Both aimed to reinvent themselves, yet found themselves drawn back into their familiar roles as director and writer respectively. Although Scream 4's narrative is concerned with the idea of a reboot or a remake, the film is actually a legacy sequel. Remakes are designed to take a hit from the past and reshape it for the sensibilities of a modern audience. Scream 4 has no interest in that, and this is shown clearly in the relative lack of engagement with the new young characters. Although important to the narrative, it would be fair to say that the film never seeks to capture the zeitgeist the way it did in 1996. It's not written by a person tapped into the youth culture, interested in the way young people talk, or pushing for dialogue that presents how articulate they wish they could be, nor does it greatly represent their communication through pop culture. Rather, Scream 4 is much more observational on the youth culture, looking at them seeing life through unhealthy lenses such as livestream, the internet, and overnight fame, also tying into their separation from the macabre history of their own town, despite it having achieved minor celebrity status itself due to the Stab movies. Scream 4 casts a glance at a seeming disrespect of history and a cynical indifference to the idea of suffering. Scream 4 would be the last Scream film in the hands of the original creative team, and indeed the last film directed by Wes Craven, who passed away from brain cancer in 2015. As a final comment on the genre he made such an indelible impact on, Scream 4 stands as a complicated work, struggling to make sense of an unstable, erratic period of horror. Once again, production issues were a part of the equation, resulting in rewrites which lends it a certain patchiness that echoes the inconsistency of the decade it's examining. Ultimately, however, what it appears to be is a cry of frustration at the quick return to diminished quality and the trend of falling back on old glories. The genre's successful return to healthy box office, but increasing creative stagnation and reliance on familiar territory.